Welcome. Tonight I have a very special program for you, dealing with, as usual, mysteries of our beautiful planet. This one is one of the greatest mysteries of the last 2,000 years. A little known but very much followed book that purports to be a revelation written by angels and higher beings called the Urantia book, otherwise known as the fifth epical revelation, or what some people refer to as the best kept secret on earth. This book says a lot of things about a lot of different subjects, including science. Some of the concepts that really caught my attention, aside from the spiritual teachings, is that they go into in-depth descriptions of such places as the Garden of Eden, telling you exactly what they look like, where they are currently. So let's go ahead and just review basically the geological description about this Garden of Eden that's in the Urantia book. Let's see what this Urantia book says about the Garden of Eden, about exactly what it looked like, before we set out to review a little bit of the history of what's happened in the last 24 years, and then finally to come to today and show you the garden at last. So sit tight. This is going to be a fun ride. Here we go. The Urantia book describes the Garden of Eden in paper 73. It's described as, quote, a long, narrow peninsula, almost an island, projecting westward from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. The coastline of this landmass was considerably elevated, of this long rectangular peninsula that went underwater. They're saying that the coastline of it was considerably elevated, so it shot out of the water and went straight up. And the neck that connected this peninsula with the mainland was only 27 miles wide at the narrowest point. Paper 73 also says that the great river, the river of the Garden of Eden, that watered the garden, came down from the higher lands of the peninsula and flowed east through the peninsular neck to the mainland, and thence across the lowlands of Mesopotamia to the sea beyond. It was fed by 4 tributaries which took origin in the coastal hills of the Edenic Peninsula, and these are the 4 heads of the river which, quote unquote, went out of Eden. That's from the Bible. We're also told that the mountains surrounding the garden abounded in precious stones and metals. At the center of this peninsula was a stone temple built for the Universal Father, which was the sacred shrine of the Garden of Eden. It was a central circular courtyard. Next, we're told that in connection with the violent activity of the surrounding volcanoes and the submergence of the Sicilian land bridge to Africa, the eastern floor of the Mediterranean Sea sank, carrying down beneath the waters the whole of the Edenic Peninsula. Concomitant with this vast submergence, the coastline of the eastern Mediterranean was greatly elevated. The Isthmus of Gibraltar, protecting the western basin of the Mediterranean, gave way as the result of an earthquake, quickly raising this inland lake to the level of the Atlantic Ocean. Presently, the Sicilian land bridge submerged, creating one of the Mediterranean and connecting it with the Atlantic Ocean. So let's just briefly see what we're being told here. We're told that the Garden of Eden was a peninsula, and that it was long and narrow, and it projected westward from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. So when I saw this in 1998, obviously the first thing to do is to look for bathymetric or underwater maps, which at that time were not available. I'm going to show you a map or an image of the kinds of images that were available to me at that time, so you can see how this process moved on. There wasn't much data, and I could not at that point see any neck anywhere in the eastern Mediterranean, and it soon became apparent that I would need better maps. And so started my search with NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. At the time, I was in Boulder, Colorado. They have a major center there, and I visited with their scientists. And I finally got my hands on some data that a ship had recently gathered in that region. And I started to work with geophysicists and asked them to create maps and 3D models of this data set that I had so excitedly set my hands on. And then came the first maps, and I laid them on the floor in my apartment. I was so excited, and for the first time, this is around 1999, I saw that there was a neck. There was a neck that very much looked like it was coming down from the coastline and sliding downward towards a flat plain below. But what was most interesting and one of the most significant parts of the clues that are in the Urantia book is the river. The river path that went through the neck onto the mainland and beyond was one of those landmarks that was crucial to find. And here was the first map that I myself had to generate with the help of scientists around the world. And we were literally looking at the eastern Mediterranean seafloor. Even though it was still very hazy compared to what's available now, at the time, it was the best look at the seafloor, and the neck did show up there. So that caused a lot of excitement, obviously, and I wrote a book in the next few years called Discovery of Atlantis, the startling case for the island of Cyprus. The reason that I talked about Atlantis instead of Eden is that Plato's account of Atlantis is eerily similar to the story of the Garden of Eden in the Urantia book. So we're told that the Gibraltar broke, that the water rushed in, the basin went down and took the island with it. This was in 1955 when this book was published. None of this was known. Nothing was known about tectonic plates. It would be another decade or two before we understood or even realized that such a thing existed as tectonic plates shifting and moving. Nothing was known about the flood that came from the Strait of Gibraltar when the earthquake hit and that Gibraltar broke again and separated and allowed the Atlantic to rush into what was a far emptier basin spotted with lakes and lagoons and so forth. That also was not known. The flood wasn't, nothing about the flood was known. Nothing about tectonic plates was known. And of course, nothing was known about the seafloor itself. So here's a book in 1955 that's describing something which at the time was completely unknown. Namely, the shifting of tectonic plates, the flood ensuing from the Strait of Gibraltar when these two tectonic plates shifted apart and an earthquake broke that gap and allowed the Atlantic to rush in. And they say that the water, the volume of water that rushed in through this was 70,000 times larger than Niagara Falls. So just imagine the unbelievable catastrophe that this breach of the Gibraltar brought about for the people that were living in the Mediterranean basin at that time. So what I did at that point is we created 3D models that allowed us to bring the sea level down by increments, whatever increments I wanted. And we brought it down and basically filled up the basin with water, simulating what it would have looked like once the water from the Atlantic pushed in and filled up the eastern Mediterranean seafloor, to see what it would look like at each interval, at each depth. And when we brought this water up to a certain depth, this island emerged with the plain at the bottom of it, a oval plain at the bottom of it that had a neck that was concave, that was very obviously going towards the mainland and coming up as it came up to the city of Latakia in modern Syria. There was actually a river path on the mainland that was proportionally and directionally in tune with the neck and the river path that very much seemed like was carrying the river of the Garden of Eden. So this was amazing news, and this compelled us to go further. If you look at the right side of the screen, you'll see that in the middle of this rectangular plain, this valley at the base of Cyprus, about 1,500 meters down, about a mile and a half down, roughly 5,200 feet, if I remember correctly. So if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see our rectangular plain. You can see that it is surrounded by mountains on either side. And remember that one of the clues that we were told was that it's encircled, the Garden of Eden was encircled by mountains, and that the rivers originated on these highlands, flowed, created a river that went out through the neck. The first expedition was aimed at getting to that central sector, that mound in the middle of the rectangular plain, because if that's where the Father's temple was, maybe there was something we could find by dragging a sonar device directly over that spot. Now this was these are incredibly challenging missions. Our available technology for underwater work is still quite primitive. It's just beginning. We're just really starting to see what the seafloors look like in depth, because radar doesn't penetrate water, and so you have to do this very expensive, complicated, time-consuming procedure where you drag this sonar device behind the ship and do a zigzag line and come up with limited data and hope there are no errors. And of course that requires a lot of money, a lot of expertise, and a research vessel. Just 2 weeks before we were supposed to set out on this expedition, new maps came. And these new maps were quite startling because this is what they showed. And these new maps were quite startling because the mound that I had specifically set my eyes on, which was in the middle of this rectangular plain, and there are many mounds in that area, but this one was right in the middle. And lo and behold, this image came just before our expedition in 2004. This is that mound, which is now seen in higher resolution, and it had a flat top. But what was incredible is that it had a wall at the base, a double wall, and it had a 90-degree angle to it. More than that, the summit itself was flat, and it fit the description of Atlantis to such an uncanny level that it was hard to accept that it could be coincidental. Not only was there a wall at the base of what would have been the Acropolis Hill, which is this middle mound where the temples were, but it was this wall was 1.5 miles away from the summit. That would have meant a 3-mile diameter, which is the description of the Acropolis Hill in Plato's works. Besides that, it also had, halfway down this mountain, there is an actual ditch or canal halfway down, running along the length, and then it meets up with a river path that comes down to the wall on both sides. And this is, again, another description that is in Plato's work about Atlantis, was that there was a canal halfway down, and these river paths or canals would collect the water and then bring it down, and there'd be a wall at the base that was 3 miles in diameter circling this mountain. The second map showed this outrageous formation, which to all intents and purposes does not look natural, matches Plato's description to an uncanny degree, and it just happened to be that one mound that I had pointed to. So this compelled us to keep going. I knew that in order to be able to prove any of this, I would have to get a closer look at those walls with the 90-degree angles at the base of this mountain. And so a couple of years later, with great trouble, we formed another expedition. This one was even better equipped. It was funded partially by the History Channel, partially by the government of Cyprus, partially by investors. And this second expedition, we were going to use not only a sonar, but also a sub-bottom profiler, which is a machine that you lower and it actually penetrates the mud. So we're not just mapping the underwater topography, but we're trying to see what's under it, especially this wall at the base of the mountain. And so that was the aim of the expedition. Luckily, we did do the job, and we did lower the sub-bottom profiler, and this geophysicist on the ship with me gave me the horrific news that it is not man-made, that it is geological. As you can imagine, this was a great disappointment, not just for me, for many people that were involved, but especially for me, having lost the better part of 10 years of the prime of my life, putting these expeditions together. And after all of that, coming out without any kind of evidence was painful. Every year since then, I've stayed in contact with my geophysicist friends. And every year, the answer was no. 15 years went by until this year, 2022, when I finally got a yes, to my utter surprise after all this time. And I was able to see the Eastern Mediterranean seafloor in maps, 3D models that would have only been a dream in 1998 for us. Now we're really looking at it in depth. We're looking at relatively high resolution compared to what was available 20 years ago anyway. And I'm just now going to show you this island. All right, it's time to get down to business. Here we have a map showing the Mediterranean Sea. You can see over here the Strait of Gibraltar. This is where the flood happened, by the African plate separating from the European plate, and the water from the Atlantic Ocean rushing into the Western Mediterranean up until this part, which is the Sicilian land bridge, where you can see how it's sunk and the water flowed in and consequently filled up the Eastern Mediterranean. Here's our area of interest between Cyprus and Syria, near the city of Latakia. So let us get moving so I can show you where the Garden of Eden is today. You can see this map. It's a lot more higher resolution than what we certainly had 20 years ago, where we really didn't know what the seafloor of the Eastern Mediterranean looked like in any kind of detail. And just 20 years later, we have the entire planet mapped above and below water, just to let you know the speed with which technology is helping us to see things that have never been available to humanity before. And that is the progress that has helped us to get to where we are today, which is where we can see everything clearly and finally put this matter to rest and prove that the Urantia revelation did indeed predict exactly what happened and what the island looked like and how it went under before science had any knowledge of any of these things. As you can see, as I'm going to get closer and closer, here's the city of Latakia. Here's the island of Cyprus. This red line is where the coastline is. Everything in blue and green is underwater. So what we initially thought during the time of the expedition, because the maps were so unclear and so incomplete, was that it looked very much like this was the river path, and it lined up with the river path near Latakia, and it looked very much like the river flowed in above the Latakia Ridge and flowed in through that, what we thought was the neck area, and on to this plain right here. As the new maps came in the last few years, and this latest one, which is literally brand new and available to the world, let me zoom in a little more and show you what's going on here. So like I said, we thought that the river that was right here flowed in through here and to the garden. But as the new maps were developed, and as we got closer and closer, I noticed something that was quite startling and put all the previous theories to rest, because this changed everything. As I said earlier, really the main clue as to where this rectangular plain was is the river path, the river that flowed from the mainland to the peninsula itself. That would have been the clear marker. This was called a great river. This was a large river that flowed from the summit of this mountainous rectangular peninsula out through the neck, under the walls, and onto the mainland. And we're told that it went sort of down here until it went down to Mesopotamia and the sea beyond. As these new maps were developed, something very interesting showed up that changed everything. As I get closer, it's going to get clearer and clearer for you where the error was and what these new maps and 3D models showed us and how they corrected the theory. Because if you look closer, the river path is not going to the north of the Latakia Ridge. The river path is actually flowing on to the Latakia Ridge. And you can clearly see this river path flowing on top of this rectangular plain. So what wound up happening is the realization that the peninsula is far smaller than we had imagined, and all of this simply because of incomplete maps that threw us off. But now we have a much clearer view. We can see that the river coming from Latakia, and remember, the river path is still there on the mainland, is right over here. It would have flowed right around here, right onto the river path, and you can still see the outline of this incredible river path. So the theory is now completely different. It's a much smaller landmass, and it's actually much closer to Syria than Cyprus. So I'm going to get closer and closer and stop talking for a while so I can show you what you're all here to see, which is what this island looked like. And as I turn this into a 3D model, you're going to see the long rectangular peninsula. And once you see it, what you'll be looking at is what used to be the Garden of Eden. So strap on, imagine you're on a giant bird flying over the Garden of Eden. This is what they would have seen as they did it. Here is your rectangular plain. It was actually this entire landmass. And here is the rectangular plain. And here is the river path. I'm going to get closer and closer to it. But this is basically the Garden of Eden. And it is quite long and rectangular, much smaller than we had anticipated previously. Let me just spin around for a little while so you can see it in all its glory. Here is the rectangular plain. It ends right around here. It would have been a very long, very rectangular plain. You can see that it does indeed rise sharply off the seafloor. This is where the entrance would have been, right around here. And here's the river path. I'm going to turn it around so you can see it from the other angle, so you can see just how long and rectangular it really was. There it is, right here. What else do we know about it? We're told that the landmass was considerably elevated, and from here to here is about 1,200 meters, just short of a mile, I think, something like that. So how it would have worked, we're told that there was a 27-mile wide wall that was built to guard this most sacred landmass. 27 miles wide is roughly from here to about here. It's hard to know what exactly this area would have looked like before the landmass went down, before the Mediterranean basin sank, but they would have built some kind of a wall to cut this whole area off, this whole area. All you would have to do is build a wall from here to roughly here, and they had 12 gates, so around every 2 miles from here to here there would have been a gate that led to the inner larger wall, and if you got past that, you would have been in the Garden of Eden. So this area that's still above water actually used to belong to the Garden of Eden. It would have been the agricultural grounds. It wouldn't have been part of the garden itself. It would have been part of the neck area, or what would have been inside the wall. So this still would have been a part of the Garden of Eden above land. Is there any chance of finding remnants of those two walls? Not with current technology, but someday it probably will. Some kind of an outline will probably showing a straight line all the way here, cutting this whole landmass and giving us a perfectly protected isthmus or peninsula. I'm going to spin around it a little more. I'm going to concentrate a little bit on the garden itself, the Edenic Peninsula, and how these things are categorized in the Urantia book. We have what's called the Edenic Peninsula, which is the actual garden area. And then we have Eden proper, we're told. Eden proper would have been everything that's inside the jurisdiction of the government of Eden, which would have been everything inside the wall that was built around here. So this area here would have been for agriculture, and it's still above water. Some point they're going to find things that go back that far back in history. But what's really interesting for us is the garden itself, or the Edenic Peninsula. We can still see, as clear as a bell, you can still see the river path. I'm going to draw it out here for you in case you don't see it. Right down here. Here's the river as it goes down. And it's still there. The great river of Eden is still clearly visible. Now we're told that this river was formed by 4 tributary rivers coming from the highlands of the peninsula. And here we have the highlands of the peninsula, especially right here. This area is actually only 200 meters below the surface of the water. So if you just went down 500 or 600 feet, you could touch the highest, what would have been the highest point of the Garden of Eden. And you can see how the winds would have come up this hill to this sharp rise. That's where the clouds would have formed right here. And this is where the rivers and likely great waterfalls would have been seen. You can see how elevated it is, and you can see how easily this river, you can even see that the riverbed is wider and deeper where these mountains were. Obviously, because of increased water activity, you probably had tremendous waterfalls and rivers. You can still see it. Where those 4 tributary rivers exactly began is difficult to know. Certainly up here, another one here, maybe some more here. We don't know. But the winds that would have carried on, come up this coast uphill, and then have to go up that ridge would have certainly formed a lot of clouds and definitely waterfall. And the river path shows exactly how things would have looked in Adam and Eve's day. Of course, we were told that there was a central sector, that the stone temple of the Universal Father was in the middle sector. This is probably the area, although it's hard to know for sure. But I would think it was somewhere around here. Somewhere in this area, in the future, you're going to find the remnants of a huge stone temple with large stone blocks that are probably still laid out in a sort of circular formation. At some point, these will be found. Remember, 20 years ago, we didn't know any of this. We couldn't see any of this. This is all new. In 20 years, the entire planet has been mapped, above and below water. As time goes on, I can imagine a time where you're going to be able to zoom in from space to any point on Earth, down to the pebbles. And I would assume that in the future, that is also going to be true for the seafloor. So as time goes on, we're going to see higher and higher resolution images of this area. But for now, let's feast our eyes on what would have been the Garden of Eden. You can see that it did indeed have the mountains where the tributary rivers would have started. And also remember that we were told that the entire peninsula itself was surrounded by mountains. It was we're told that it was virtually an island on an inland sea surrounded by mountains. So if we look all the way from here, the mountains are surrounding it all the way up there, all the way through Turkey. Also, you have the mountains here that would have surrounded it. And then on the valley, on the peninsula itself, you have the mountains that were on the Edenic Peninsula, which gave origin to the great river of Eden. Of course, as we said earlier, the river path would have flown out. The river path is still there. Here's the lake beyond. It probably would have gone out here, down there, on down to Mesopotamia and the sea beyond. As I spin around this just a little more. So remember, there's the central sector, very likely right in this area. As I zoom in on it, give you a closer look. The central sector actually with the 4 parts of the garden. Remember that there was a central sector and they divided the garden itself into 4 parts, north, south, east, and west. The east of Eden would have been this area where Adam and Eve had their residence. And then you had the administrative quarters and the teaching centers and the living areas for the workers. It would have probably been down here in the south. This central sector is where the stone walls of what used to be the Universal Father's temple eventually is going to be found. I should also probably mention that the memory of the central sector with the 4 surrounding lands stayed with humanity for a long, long time. We can see it in Persian gardens. We can see it in old temple designs in Mesopotamia and also in Egypt. It may seem like a long, long period has passed, but in actuality, humanity remembers these things knowingly or subconsciously for thousands and thousands of years. Believe it or not, the sanitation is still a problem in this area with people disposing their garbage in these rivers that are on land now and polluting the rivers and lakes in the area. So yeah, not too many things have changed. Humans seem to have some trouble with divine instructions. They much prefer to listen to human beings, to other human beings. We're still doing that today by not listening to the instructions in the Urantia book, instead preferring to listen to the words, instructions, and plans of human beings, even when they contradict the clear instructions that are given in the revelation itself. We have not progressed all that far in these thousands of years. So, to recap, I think you've seen enough of this island. You can get off the Fandor bird now as I zoom out and we discuss what exactly we're talking about here. What we're talking about is a book from the 1950s, which was actually being produced in the 30s and 40s and even earlier, talking about things that humanity simply did not know at the time. Some of it we did not know until just a few months ago. So here's the Strait of Gibraltar. What we're told in the Urantia book is that there are tectonic plates that move apart, which was not known in the 1940s or 50s when the book was published. It wasn't known, that concept, until the late 1960s. Then we're told that the Mediterranean used to be a lot lower than it is today. And that was not proven by science or even contemplated until the mid-70s. The people that actually took core samples from the seafloor, and I think it was something like over a mile thick salt layer, which showed that the Mediterranean had not only dried up, but had dried up several times and leaving huge salt deposits. So that was also not known. And then we have the knowledge, we're told that the Sicilian land bridge submerged, which is right here. You can even see how it used to be. That was not known. It's now known as part of what's called the Zanclean flood theory. The Urantia book also tells us that there was a long, narrow peninsula stretching westward from the eastern Mediterranean coastline. How did they know that? There was no knowledge of what the seafloor looked like. How would they have known about this long, narrow peninsula that actually came down, stretching westward from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean? There were no bathymetric maps of the eastern Mediterranean when this book was published. It would take another few decades before we even could see brief outlines of it. But beyond that, we were also told in the book that the coastline of this landmass was considerably elevated. How would they have known that there was a long rectangular plain, first of all, stretching westward from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea? How would they have known that the coastline of it was considerably elevated? And again, here it is. How would they have known that in 1940s, or even when we say 1955 publication? There was no way they could have known that. But there's more. Not only are we told that it was considerably elevated, but we're also told about the great river running through the summit of a mountain, the mountainous rectangular plain. And this great river flowed on to the mainland and beyond. And here we have a clear outline of the river. This is only a few months old. How would they have possibly known that? And it lines up with a river path that's still on the mainland. It's actually called the El Kabir River, which means, guess what? The Great River. That is the literal translation. The Great River. It's still there. The path is still there, perfectly lined up with a river path that is on the summit of this long rectangular plain, what used to be a peninsula, and it all matches. How in the world could a book published in 1955, known about the Zanclean flood, the breach of the Gibraltar Strait, the Sicilian land bridge submersions, the desiccation of the Mediterranean Sea, a long narrow peninsula stretching westward from the eastern Mediterranean coastline that was considerably elevated and had a river running throughout? How would they have known that? They wouldn't. This is clear proof that the Urantia book is correct. I'm very happy to have had you on my side as we flew on the Garden of Eden and look at all of its beauty. How gorgeous this place must have been. We're told that it was the most beautiful place on earth at that time. Just an absolutely perfect land. As we continue exploring and discovering, certainly new things are due to come in the years ahead. I invite you to stay tuned, and I will keep you updated as time goes on if anything else comes up, and take care.